Stand together as we read from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. It's in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Here the Gospel reads, "From here he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, 'Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs.' But she answered him, 'Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs.' And he said to her, 'For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter.' So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
When I was a child, one of the birthday party staples was that game called hot potato. We would all sit in a circle and we would pass a potato while the music played, and when the music stopped, the one that was holding the potato was out. Now, it usually wasn't a hot potato. In fact, most of the time it wasn't even a potato that we played with, but nobody wanted to be out. And so we would squeal and we would laugh and we would almost throw whatever it was that we were passing to the person that was seated next to us. Now, if you've ever tried to hold a baked potato without an oven mitt, you'll know where that game got its name. Because you see, a potato radiates heat for a long time after it's cooked, because the skin around it is really tight and the center is really, really warm. Today's reading about Jesus and that Syrophoenician woman is a little bit like one of those potatoes. In fact, if we were Jesus' public relations department, we would probably suggest that he needed a little spin control on this one, because this particular passage forces us to entertain the reality of a Savior who's just a little bit messy, who is not only God, but human as well. As the story unfolds, Jesus has been addressing some key traditions of his Jewish heritage, and there's a little bit of heat that's radiating from the exchange that he has been engaged with. It's awfully tempting to want to pass this story pretty quickly. Daughter healed. Yay, Jesus. But like that really hot potato, it is also a story that is full of a lot of nourishment if we break it open and we really try to feed on what's inside. The whole thing begins on the heels of Jesus' long exchange with some religious officials about the importance of tradition. The Pharisees had noticed that Jesus' followers were coming to the table without the ceremonial washing of their hands. And Jesus was taking them to task for the insincerity of their worship. "You guys say all the right things," he told them, "but you don't really honor the commandments of God. In fact, you have found some pretty clever ways to keep the letter of the law while you violate its purpose. You tell a lie if it suits your interest, and then you rationalize your behavior. You worry about clean hands at the table, but you disregard clean hearts. You forget that it isn't what goes into your mouth that defiles you. No, it's what comes out of your mouth that matters. As you might imagine, the religious officials didn't get it. And if you'll note, the religious officials hardly ever get it when you're reading the Bible. Jesus, all worn out from his work and his struggle to be understood, decides that he needs a retreat. Now, I want you to change pictures for just a minute and try to imagine something like this. Imagine that you are the chief of staff in the ER at a large hospital, kind of like the one that's just down the road here. You've been working for months because you're trying to get a new policy manual adopted, and you have encountered significant resistance from other doctors, even the ones that are your friends. You've been putting in 18 and 20-hour days doing your job and working on the policies, reinterpreting, responding to the chaos that's created, and finally, frustrated and pretty exhausted, you decide that you need to take a trip to the mountains. The sky is blue and the air is crisp. You've just barely unpacked your overnight bag and you've stretched out on the bed for a nap when she appears at your door. A woman from a nearby town who wants you to have a look at her daughter who's critically ill. This child isn't one of your patients. She doesn't have any insurance. In fact, if you were back at the hospital, she would likely be one of those welfare cases that your policies are trying to address. But she heard that you were in town and that you were pretty good at what you do, and she's desperate for you to help her. You, on the other hand, are worn out. The world is full of a lot of hurting people, and you can't help every one of them. The urgently needed policy changes are still looming, and besides, you need a nap. What would you do? What would you do? Well, like the doctor in this imaginary story, Jesus was in foreign territory trying to escape from the incredible demands that were dogging his steps. He'd been healing the sick and feeding the hungry, even raising the dead. And through it all, he still had to address all of the demands for clarification and explanation and justification about just what the text means from his closest disciples and the religious authorities alike. He needed rest, and this brief detour among strangers was intended to bring him some relief. But word of his miraculous abilities had spread beyond the borders of his own country. And this Canaanite woman was at his door. She was seeking him out, and she was pleading her case. She's a Gentile, which means she's not one of the chosen. We might imagine her as a weeping mother, dressed in a long garment with her hair covered with her scarf, her eyes cast down. She drops to her knees and she begs for attention from the one who is rumored to heal in the name of the Hebrew God, asking him to cast aside this demonic presence that is holding her daughter's life in the balance. And Jesus stands in that doorway, looking just like one of our childhood picture books. Those long curls and that radiantly kind expression, gazing lovingly at the woman, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, searching that troubled face with all-knowing compassion and responding to her plea by granting her wish. We all already know that that's how the story is supposed to go whenever Jesus shows up. And so we're shocked, if we pay attention, when the dialogue between this woman and Jesus begins to unfold. At first, Jesus just tries to ignore the woman. Then he turns to his disciples and he tells them, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's a kind of chilling reaction. But the woman doesn't quit. Please, she says, please help me. And he looks into her eyes and he answers back to her, it's not fair to take the food that belongs to the children and throw it to the dogs. I'm thinking he might just as well have doused her with cold water and sent her on her way. Now, I don't know about you, but this is definitely not the Jesus I grew up with. This is not the untiring and unfailing love of God that we have come to expect whenever Jesus shows up in a story. And so we quickly read on. We're looking for some additional information, something that's going to salvage Jesus' reputation. We read and we reread, thinking we might have missed something. And when we don't see what we're looking for, we just take this hot potato and we try to pass it right off and go on to something else. Maybe we consult some scholarship. Maybe we're hoping to hear that given the placement of the story, we have to understand that, or, you know, what Jesus really meant to be saying was, or in that culture, it might have been like this. It's no wonder when we're so rattled that we never focus on the woman in the story. This stranger who has cornered the hero and left him looking pretty callous and cold. There she is, she's down on her hands and knees at the feet of this strange man who has just compared her and her ailing child to a mongrel animal. Her humiliation would have to be close to unbearable, but she's a mother, and the daughter that she loves is depending on her. From her perspective, her child is just as special. Her child is just as human as all of the children who have seats at the table. So she swallows what little bit of pride she has left, and she continues to talk to Jesus. Sir, she says, and I suspect it was hard for her not to choke on that kind of courtesy. Sir, even the dogs under the table are allowed to eat the children's crumbs. I suspect there was a little silence. It might have been 10 seconds or 20, maybe even a whole minute. And then Jesus speaks. Woman, because you have said this, it will be done for you as you have asked. Her daughter is healed, and in that moment the world is turned inside and outside and upside down. So what's the capital T truth in a story like this? What does it say to us if we resist the temptation to pass it off to somebody else or cover it over with excuses in order to preserve what we thought we knew about the Jesus that we love? Most obviously, I think we learn a little something about the human side of the one that we are used to thinking of as only divine. You see, back in Jesus' day, the difficult part was for the people to believe that this carpenter from Galilee was the Son of God. It was the divinity that gave them problems. But in our day, and especially for those of us in the church, we almost forget that Jesus was also human. And it's that human side of Jesus that is the most like us. As a human being, Jesus wanted to set some boundaries. He wanted to put a hedge around his mission. He wanted to hide out when he was in foreign territory. He wanted to turn his gaze away from this woman who had no legitimate claim on his energy or his time. But in the end, and this is the important part, in the end, Jesus did not do what he first wanted. He did instead what the voice of God suggested that he ought to do. It was his ultimate obedience that counted, and not that ill-considered first response to that woman. And that's what counts for the church if we want to follow Jesus. We can't just be doing whatever it is we want to do. We have to be engaged in God's work in spite of our human inclinations, and not just when we are at church, but when we are on retreat, out of town, life as usual. As a human being, Jesus saw the scope of his task in limited terms. He knew that he was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. He knew that God intended to use him to revise that policy manual for all the children that would sit at the table. In fact, he'd been fighting with the folks back home, Pharisees and disciples, in order to do exactly that. But he had lost sight of the fact that God intended him to take those same policy adjustments over into foreign territory and to feed everyone at the same table. And it took that brusque encounter with that unclean foreign woman for him to recall the vastness of the plan. You see, she had a vision for God's graciousness that Jesus the man was only beginning to grab hold of, only just beginning to imagine. It was a vision that the church has to embrace if it wants to be followers of Jesus. As a human being, Jesus thought he already knew everything he needed to know to do God's work. When he told those scribes and the Pharisees that they needed to lighten up and they needed to draw their circle a little bit bigger, he thought he knew who was meant to be included and who was meant to be left out. But God has a way of speaking new truths when we least expect it. And Jesus learned a lesson that day in the faraway land of Tyre. Any faithful follower of Jesus, any follower of Jesus back then in those days would have taken one look at that Syrophoenician woman and would have said, "You are absolutely right, Jesus. You don't have to heal her child. She's not one of us." But God looked at that Syrophoenician woman and God said, "Son, she is my daughter, just like you're my son. Now I want you to listen to her. Listen to her." And so we end this day with a question. What do we do with the people whose presence offends us? Are we required to turn our attention in their direction? Are we supposed to interrupt our lives in progress to respond to their needs? Do we have to feed them from the table that belongs to the children? And the answer to that is no. No, we don't. Unless, of course, we want to be the church of Jesus Christ. And if we want to be the church of Jesus Christ, then the question boils down to this. When you read the hot potato story, what did Jesus do? The challenge to us is to go then and to do likewise. Amen.